What's the most ridiculous house rule you followed that ended with everyone in the operating room? My husband nearly died trying to prove a point. A point he believed was more important than his own life, or the health of our children. The anger, the fear, the sheer betrayal I felt in that moment. It changed everything. It started so simply. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for what I thought would be a delicious, healthy taco night for my family. The aroma of spices was just beginning to fill the air when a whirlwind hit. My kids, Ellen and Tori, burst in, practically vibrating with excitement. "Dad promised McDonald's!" they shouted, their faces alight with greasy anticipation. A sigh escaped me. McDonald's. Again. This was the fourth time this week. "No, absolutely not," I said, shaking my head. "We're not eating that again. It's unhealthy." But before I could even finish, my husband, Mark, cut me off, his voice sharp and dismissive. "Stop being so controlling. I'm the man of the house and we eat what we want." My heart sank. I tried to explain, calmly, reasonably, that our kids needed a balanced diet, real home-cooked meals, not fast food every single day. But he wasn't listening. He just turned to Ellen and Tori, a wide conspiratorial smile plastered across his face. "Mommy acts like she's such a smarty-pants sometimes, always telling us what to do. But Daddy says you should eat what makes you happy." The kids, of course, cheered. They hugged him tight, completely oblivious to the dagger he'd just plunged into my chest. I stood there, surrounded by the scent of fresh vegetables and betrayal, feeling like the enemy in my own home. "You're not their friend," I reminded him, my voice barely a whisper. "You're their father. We can't always do what they want." He scoffed, a dark laugh escaping him. "And you're not a nutritionist," he shot back, his eyes narrowed. "I'm tired of all your nagging about, 'Oh, you can't have fried food again,' or, 'Oh, don't give the kids candy.' Give it a break, you little food dictator. Let me handle our meals from now on." My jaw tightened. A food dictator? After everything? I watched them walk out the door, off to McDonald's for the fifth time that week, and a cold, dangerous thought formed in my mind. Fine, I thought. If he wants to be in charge of food, he can have it all. And I did. I stopped cooking. I stopped suggesting healthier options. I stopped everything entirely. The first week, for them, was like a dream. Daily McDonald's runs. Candies with every meal. Mark would come home with bags of fast food, holding them up like he'd just returned from a heroic hunt, presenting his spoils to his adoring family. He even bragged to his co-workers about how peaceful his house was now that the food police had been disbanded. And they actually encouraged him, sending texts like, "Lucky man, I wish my wife was that cool." He'd show me those texts, a smug smile on his face, twisting the knife just a little deeper. But by the second week, the dream started to sour. I noticed Mark getting winded just walking up our driveway. He'd pause at the doorway, fumbling with his keys, pretending to search for them while he secretly caught his breath. The kids struggled too. Ellen, my son, started getting teased and left out in PE because he couldn't run without getting sick. My sweet Tori, my daughter, came home crying and utterly humiliated after her uniform pants split, and her friends teased her about her weight and eating habits. "Do you always scarf down food like that?" her best friend had asked, right in front of everyone. When I tried, tentatively, to suggest we go back to eating my balanced meals, Mark just laughed it off. "They're just growing," he'd say. He bought them bigger uniforms, bigger jackets, trying to hide the problem, to hide the truth that was becoming painfully obvious. Things only got worse. Mark fell over and injured his back trying to tie his shoelaces. He had to switch to slip-ons just to go to work. He started getting stuck in restaurant booths, spilling into the seats beside him. Even our own relatives started to tease them. At Thanksgiving, when Mark reached over to refill his plate for the third time, his brother snickered, "Whoa there, that platter's for sharing, not for one person." Everyone burst out laughing, sharing twisted jokes about their weight. The kids looked mortified, but Mark's response was always the same to every humiliation. "The world's not built for real-sized people." By the way, if you're still with me and finding yourself caught up in this family's wild journey, please hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next, trust me. It wasn't until the trampoline incident that the reality truly started to hit home. Tori's friend had a birthday party, complete with a massive trampoline. When Ellen jumped on, there was a horrible ripping sound, and the whole thing collapsed. 20 kids watched him fall through. That day, both my kids came into my room, their faces etched with a desperate plea. "Mom," Tori whispered, "can you secretly make us a veggie sandwich? Please don't tell Dad." My heart ached for them. I didn't hesitate. I immediately started making them proper food, packing them healthy lunches, and taking them out to the park to get some much-needed exercise. It felt like a quiet act of rebellion, a secret alliance forming in the face of Mark's stubbornness. But then, Mark's birthday arrived, and something completely turned things around. That Saturday, he brought us to a local steakhouse, not for a quiet family dinner, but so he could sign up for their notorious 72-ounce steak challenge. "I've got to show everyone what a real man can do," he boasted, puffing out his chest. The kids looked visibly uncomfortable, their eyes darting between him and me. I watched him at the table, halfway through the massive steak. His face was beet red, sweat pouring down his forehead. A crowd had gathered, cheering him on, egging him on to continue this dangerous charade. Finally, I couldn't bear it anymore. "Please, Mark," I begged, my voice trembling. "Stop. This is insane." He glared at me, his mouth full of meat. "Stop controlling me," he growled. Then, Ellen, my brave, usually quiet son, tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, please listen to Mom. This isn't good." Mark refused, his eyes blazing with anger, even at his own child. "Don't be a weak piece of crap like your mother," he spat. Tori started crying then, her little voice choked with fear. "Daddy, you look sick. Please stop eating. Can you all just shut up and let me do what I want?" he roared, slamming his fist on the table. "I'm the man of this family." He continued eating, just to prove his point. His eyes suddenly went wide. His hand flew to his chest. The fork clattered onto the plate with a sound that instantly silenced the cheering crowd. He looked at the kids, pure terror etched on his face, before collapsing, face first, into what was left of the steak. Tori screamed. Ellen froze, a statue of pure shock. The crowd scattered in a panic, shouting for 911. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and Tori's heartbreaking sobs, paramedics yelling numbers I didn't understand. Now, I was sitting in a hospital waiting room. Both kids pressed against my sides. Ellen had his face buried in my shoulder, refusing to look up. Tori kept asking if Daddy was going to die, and I kept saying, no, even though I had absolutely no idea if that was true. Nurses rushed past us in the hallway, their voices urgent, talking about cardiac arrest and blocked arteries. A woman at the desk kept glancing at us with this sad, pitying look on her face. The fluorescent lights made everything feel too bright, too real. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. A surgeon in blue scrubs walked toward us, and I stood up so fast the kids almost toppled over. He introduced himself, but his name dissolved into the ringing in my ears. He was holding a clipboard, his face grim. He told me my husband needed emergency triple bypass surgery right now. 90% of his arteries were blocked. He could die without immediate intervention. The surgeon handed me consent forms and a pen. I tried to read the papers, but the words swam together. My hands shook so badly, I could barely hold the pen. The kids watched me, their faces tiny masks of terror. Line after line after line. I signed everything. The surgeon took the forms back, telling me the surgery would take several hours, then walked away quickly. I pulled the kids back down onto the cold, plastic chairs. Tori asked what triple bypass meant. I explained that the doctors needed to fix Daddy's heart because it was very sick. Ellen finally looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. I told them both that Daddy was going to be okay. I said it with as much confidence as I could possibly manage. But sitting there in that cold waiting room, my kids clinging to me, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Hours dragged on. The kids eventually fell asleep against me. My legs went numb, but I didn't move. I didn't want to wake them. Finally, a woman in surgical scrubs approached. She was older, with gray hair pulled back tight. She introduced herself as Dr. Cara Watkins, the lead cardiac surgeon. She sat down across from us, and I gently woke the kids. Dr. Watkins spoke clearly, directly. "The bypass surgery was successful," she said. "They rerouted blood flow around the blocked arteries." But then she looked right at me. "The damage to his heart is significant," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "He'll need major lifestyle changes, a long recovery period, cardiac rehabilitation. Then she paused. And, she added, we found something unusual during the surgery. Something in his stomach. She explained it was a bezoar, a compacted mass of undigested material. This one was almost entirely red meat, the size of a softball. It had been sitting in his stomach for months, maybe longer. The surgical team was so surprised by its size and composition, they were considering writing it up for a medical journal. I felt sick to my stomach just listening. Dr. Watkins looked directly at me again, her gaze piercing. Family support will determine whether he survives the next 5 years. The way she said it made it clear she was putting this squarely on my shoulders. She stood up, telling us we could see him in a few hours once he was stable in the ICU, then walked away. The kids looked at me, questions plastered all over their faces, but I had no answers yet. While we waited, I sat there, replaying the last few months in my mind. It all started with those veggie tacos. I was just trying to feed my family something healthy after 4 straight days of McDonald's. But Mark had turned it into a huge power struggle. He called me controlling. Said he was the man of the house and he'd decide what we ate. The kids cheered him on like he was some kind of hero, and I was the villain. And I just stood there, in my own kitchen, feeling like the enemy. He dismissed every concern I raised about nutrition. Called me a food dictator. He even told his coworkers I was the food police, and they encouraged him, sending texts saying he was lucky and they wished their wives were cool like that. So I stopped fighting. I stopped cooking. I stopped suggesting healthier options. I just completely withdrew, let him take over all the meals. And he did. He fed them McDonald's every single day. Sometimes twice a day. Bags of fast food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Candy with every meal. He'd come home holding up those greasy bags like he'd accomplished something great. The kids loved it at first, thought it was the best thing ever. And I watched it happen. Watched them all gain weight. Watched Mark struggle to walk up our driveway. Watched Ellen get teased at school and Tori split her uniform pants. I tried to say something, but he shut me down every time. He bought bigger clothes to hide the problem, made excuses, blamed everything except his own choices. And now here we were, in a hospital, him fighting for his life, all because he had to prove he was the man of the house. I looked over at Ellen and Tori, sitting silently in the ICU waiting area. They'd stopped crying, but now they were just still, staring at nothing, switching between anger and guilt and fear. I could see it all playing across their young faces. Tori suddenly whispered that this was her fault. She said she kept asking for McDonald's, kept begging Daddy to take them. If she hadn't wanted it so much, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Ellen nodded. He confessed he should have listened when I warned them about eating healthy. He admitted he'd made fun of the veggie sandwiches I tried to pack, called them gross, and chose the chicken nuggets instead. My heart shattered. I pulled them both close against me. This is not your fault, I told them, my voice firm despite the ache in my chest. Not even a little bit. Grown-ups make the decisions. Daddy made bad choices about food. Really bad choices. But we're all going to help him get better now. We're going to be a team. Tori asked if Daddy was going to die. I told her the doctors fixed his heart, and now we needed to help him stay healthy. Ellen asked if we had to eat McDonald's anymore. I shook my head. No, I said, a wave of relief washing over me. We're done with that. We're going to eat real food at home. Food that makes our bodies strong. Tori started crying again, but this time it was different. Like she was relieved, like she'd been waiting for permission to stop. I held them both, and we sat there together in that awful waiting room, with its flickering lights and the smell of disinfectant, waiting to see if their father was going to survive. My phone started buzzing in my pocket, a relentless vibration against my thigh. I pulled it out to see a flood of text messages. Relatives asking what happened, friends wanting details. Then I saw a message from Mark's brother that made my blood boil. It said, "Guess those steak challenges finally caught up with him. LOL," followed by 3 laughing emojis. I stared at that message, pure rage building in my chest. I typed back, "This isn't funny. We need support, not jokes right now." He responded with another laughing emoji and said he was just keeping it real. Aita. End off all my notifications. except for immediate family. More calls started coming in, aunts and uncles and cousins, people we barely talked to, suddenly very interested in the drama. I answered a few, keeping my responses short and factual. Yes, he had a heart attack. Yes, he's in surgery. No, I don't know more details yet. They all made comments about his weight, about how they saw this coming, about how he should have listened to me. Like they were suddenly on my side after months of encouraging his behavior, after laughing at Thanksgiving when he filled his plate 3 times, after sending him texts saying I was too controlling. Now they wanted to act concerned and caring. I stopped answering the calls, put my phone on silent. The kids didn't need to hear me dealing with this right now. They didn't need to know their uncle thought this was funny, that their relatives were treating this like gossip instead of a real crisis. A nurse finally approached and said we could see him for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. She led us down a hallway and through double doors into the ICU. The smell hit me first, antiseptic and something else I couldn't identify. We walked past other rooms with other patients, machines beeping everywhere. The nurse stopped at a room and gestured for us to go in. I saw him before the kids did, lying in the bed with tubes coming out of his arms and chest and nose. Machines all around him, beeping and flashing numbers. His face was pale and puffy, swollen in a way that didn't look like him. The kids froze in the doorway. I took their hands and pulled them forward gently. We stood beside the bed. His chest rose and fell, but it was the ventilator doing the work. In that moment, all my anger dissolved into something else. Pure fear. This man who was shouting at me in a steakhouse yesterday now looked so small and helpless. The kids were crying again. I reached out and took his hand. It was cold and limp. I told him he needed to fight. Needed to come back to us. The kids needed their father. I needed him. Despite everything he'd put us through these past months, despite the fighting and the stubbornness and the terrible choices, I realized I still loved him. I still wanted him to survive this. I wanted him to get better and be the man I married. The man who used to care about our family's well-being. The nurse touched my shoulder. Our time is up. I squeezed his hand one more time. We'll be back soon, I whispered. The kids each touched his arm gently. Then we walked back out into the hallway, and the door closed behind us. A woman in business clothes caught me in the hallway as we headed back to the waiting room. She introduced herself as the hospital billing coordinator. She had a folder in her hands and a sympathetic expression on her face. She explained that even with our insurance, we were looking at significant out-of-pocket costs. The surgery alone was expensive. Then there was the hospital stay, the cardiac rehabilitation program he'd need, the medications, the follow-up appointments. She estimated we'd owe at least $30,000 over time. Maybe more depending on how long his recovery took. My stomach dropped. She added that Mark would need to take disability leave from work for at least 2 months, possibly longer. I did the math in my head. Disability paid 60% of his normal salary. We were already living paycheck to paycheck before this happened. Panic rose in my chest, cold and suffocating. How were we going to pay our mortgage, our car payments, the kids' school expenses? Now, add $30,000 in medical bills on top of everything else. The coordinator was still talking about payment plans and financial assistance programs, but I could barely hear her over the roaring in my ears. She handed me some paperwork and told me to fill it out when I had time. I took the papers with numb hands. She walked away. I stood there in the hallway, trying to breathe, trying not to completely fall apart in front of my kids. This was going to destroy us financially. Even if he survived, even if he recovered, we were going to be drowning in debt for years. Dr. Watkins came back several hours later with a full post-surgery report. She sat down with us in a small consultation room. The kids were half asleep, but I wanted them to hear this. She explained that the triple bypass went well overall. His heart was pumping adequately now. The blood flow had been restored. But then she started talking about the Bezor again. She pulled out photos on her tablet. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. The mass they removed from his stomach was huge, dark, and compacted. It looked almost solid, like a ball of clay. She explained it was almost entirely undigested red meat compressed together over months of excessive meat consumption. The stomach acid couldn't break it down fast enough. It just kept accumulating, getting bigger and harder. The surgical team was shocked when they found it, she said. They'd seen Bezors before, but never one this large or this composition. Usually, they're made of fiber or hair. This was pure meat. They were considering writing it up for a medical journal, possibly naming the condition after him if they published. She swiped through more photos, showing different angles. I felt sick looking at it. That thing was sitting in his stomach while he kept eating more and more meat. While he did that steak challenge. While he refused to listen to any warnings about his diet. Dr. Watkins put the tablet away and looked at me seriously. "This is a warning sign we can't ignore," she stated. His body was literally unable to process the amount of meat he was consuming. "This has to change, or he won't survive another year." Dr. Watkins then asked if she could talk to the kids privately for a few minutes. I was hesitant, but she insisted it was important they understood what happened. She brought Ellen and Tori into a small consultation room. I followed and sat quietly in the corner. She had a plastic model of a heart on the table. She picked it up and showed them how a healthy heart works. "Blood flows through these vessels called arteries," she explained. "But when you eat too much bad food, the arteries get clogged up, like a pipe getting blocked with gunk." She pointed to the model, showing where the blockages were in their father's heart. 90% blocked, almost completely shut off. The heart couldn't get enough blood. That's why he collapsed. She explained in simple terms that their dad's body couldn't handle all that meat and grease anymore. It made him very, very sick. Tori asked, in a tiny voice, if they were going to get sick, too. Dr. Watkins didn't sugarcoat it. She said honestly that they were heading in that direction. But they were young. Their bodies could still recover if they changed their eating habits now. If they started eating vegetables and fruits and healthy foods. If they stopped eating fast food every day. Ellen asked how long it would take to get better. She said it depended on the person, but their bodies would start feeling better within weeks if they made good choices. She emphasized that this wasn't about being skinny or looking a certain way. It was about being healthy enough to run and play and live a long life. The kids both nodded seriously. I could see them actually understanding for the first time. This wasn't mom being controlling. This was real. This was life or death. On the second day, Mark finally woke up. The nurse came to get us, and we rushed to his room. He was groggy and confused. The ventilator tube was out, but he had an oxygen mask on. His first words were asking what happened. "Did I finish the steak challenge?" he rasped. I stared at him in disbelief. That was his first question? Not how were the kids? Not was I okay? Whether he finished eating the giant steak. I explained, as calmly as I could, that he collapsed. Had a heart attack. Needed emergency triple bypass surgery. He blinked slowly, trying to process this. Then he said, "It must have been bad luck. Maybe the steak was spoiled. The restaurant should have checked their meat better." I felt anger flaring up again. Hot and sharp. I told him about the 90% blockage. About the bezoar they removed from his stomach, the ball of undigested meat the size of a softball. He shook his head. "That doesn't make sense," he insisted. "I've always eaten meat my whole life. This must be something else. Some genetic problem. Maybe the doctors made a mistake." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was lying in a hospital bed after nearly dying, and he still wouldn't admit that his choices caused this. Still blaming everything except himself, the restaurant, his genetics, the doctors, anyone but him. Ellen spoke up from beside me. "The doctor told us it was from eating too much bad food." Mark looked at his son. "Doctors don't know everything. They just want to blame people for being happy." Tori started crying. I took both kids by the hands and walked out of the room. I couldn't listen to this anymore. Couldn't watch him lie to himself, and to them. The nurse followed us out and gently suggested we give him time to process everything. But I knew the truth. Time wouldn't change anything. He was going to fight this every step of the way. The next morning, a man in scrubs walked into the room carrying a thick folder and introduced himself as Rhett Watkins from the hospital nutrition department. He spread printed charts and meal plans across the bed tray, pointing to lists of approved foods with portion sizes measured in cups and ounces. Grilled chicken breast, 4 ounces. Steamed broccoli, 1 cup. Brown rice, half a cup. He went through each category, explaining what Mark could and could not eat, emphasizing lean proteins and lots of vegetables while avoiding anything fried or processed. Mark scrolled through his phone, barely glancing at the colorful charts. Rhett asked if he understood the plan, And Mark waved his hand without looking up. Rhett leaned forward and said firmly that following this plan wasn't optional if he wanted to avoid another heart attack, pulling out statistics about patients who ignore dietary advice. Mark muttered that he'd figure it out at home. I sat there watching this interaction, feeling my exhaustion deepen, because I recognized this pattern so clearly. The nurse had told us earlier that morning we could take the kids to the cafeteria for lunch since Mark would be sleeping most of the day anyway. We rode the elevator down 3 floors and walked through the automatic doors into a bright space that smelled like coffee and disinfectant. The kids headed straight for the hot food line out of pure habit, reaching for chicken nuggets and French fries without thinking. But then both of them paused, their hands hovering over the serving utensils. Tori pulled her hand back and picked up a red apple from the fruit basket instead, turning it over in her palm like she'd never seen one before. Ellen grabbed his usual turkey sandwich, but then added a small container of salad with ranch dressing on the side. I watched this happen and felt something loosen in my chest. They sat down at a table near the window, and I told them I was proud of their choices, keeping my voice casual and light so it didn't feel like a huge deal. They both looked at me with small smiles, and Tori bit into her apple with an audible crunch. This was the first time in months they'd chosen something healthy without me forcing them or sneaking it to them behind their father's back. It was a tiny victory, but it felt significant. Later that afternoon, Rhett came back to schedule cardiac rehab appointments, and Mark immediately waved him off. He said he'd just walk around the block at home for exercise, that he didn't need some fancy program. Rhett explained patiently that cardiac rehab was supervised therapy with trained staff who monitored his heart rate and blood pressure, adjusting his activity level to keep him safe while he built strength. Mark crossed his arms and said he didn't need babysitting. I sat in the chair by the window, watching this interaction, and felt exhausted all over again. This was the same stubborn refusal to accept help that got us into this mess in the first place. The same insistence that he knew better than the professionals. The same pattern repeating itself less than 48 hours after he nearly died. That evening, after the kids fell asleep in the waiting room chairs, Mark asked me to stop at McDonald's on the way home from the hospital tomorrow. I looked at him for a long moment, then told him clearly and calmly that I wouldn't be buying fast food anymore. He started to argue, but I cut him off before he could build momentum. I said I'd cook healthy meals at home, and he could make his own choices about what he ate, but I wasn't going to help him kill himself. The kids were awake now, watching this exchange with wide eyes. Mark opened his mouth to respond, and then closed it again. For the first time since this whole thing started, he didn't have a comeback. 2 days later, I was at home sorting through mail when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman introduced herself as Dana Murphy, the school counselor, and said she needed to meet with me about the bullying Ellen and Tori had been experiencing related to their weight. She explained that she'd noticed both kids withdrawing socially over the past few weeks, and Ellen had been skipping PE class with complaints of stomach aches. She wanted to create a support plan to help them. I scheduled a meeting for next week and thanked her multiple times before hanging up. It felt good to know that someone at the school was paying attention and actually wanted to help instead of just calling it kids being kids. The meeting happened on a Tuesday afternoon in Dana's small office, motivational posters on the walls. She sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and outlined a plan that included modified PE activities for Ellen while he built his stamina back up. Regular lunch check-ins with both kids to make sure they were eating and feeling okay. And a conversation with students in their classes about body respect and kindness. She also suggested that the school nurse monitor their progress and provide encouragement as they worked on building healthier habits. She was creating a whole support system that extended beyond just our family. I left that meeting feeling validated and relieved that we had allies helping the kids navigate this difficult transition. When I got home, there were 3 large boxes sitting on the front porch. I opened them to find care packages from Mark's coworkers, filled with candy bars, bags of chips, cookies, and processed snacks. The cards attached said things like, "Get well soon, buddy," and "Thinking of you." I thanked them politely through text, but carried all the boxes straight to the garage and stacked them in the corner behind the recycling bins. Then I sent a group text to all the coworkers, explaining that we were focusing on healthy foods during Mark's recovery and asking them not to send any more junk food. Some of them responded with understanding messages and heart emojis. Others sent back laughing faces and comments about me being no fun. One guy wrote, "Wow, someone's serious," with a string of eye roll emojis. The responses made me angry, but I didn't engage any further. A few days later, Rhett called my cell phone to follow up on how things were going at home. During the conversation, he mentioned that the hospital had a family therapy program for patients recovering from cardiac events, because the stress of a health crisis often reveals underlying relationship issues that need to be addressed. I was skeptical about therapy in general, but I agreed to try one session because we needed all the help we could get if we were going to survive this as a family. He emailed me information about a therapist named Sesh Newman who specialized in health crises and family dynamics. That same afternoon, I walked past the bedroom and heard Mark on the phone with one of his friends. His voice carried through the half-open door as he bragged about almost dying doing the 72-ounce challenge like a boss. He was laughing and making jokes about the whole thing, calling it just a little heart thing, and saying the doctors overreacted. I stood in the hallway listening to him minimize the surgery that saved his life and felt anger surge through me, mixed with fear. He hadn't learned anything from this. Not a single thing. When he hung up, I walked into the room. "If you're not taking this seriously," I told him, my voice steady, "then I need to protect myself and the kids from watching you die." He looked startled, like he didn't realize I was listening. That night, I made veggie tacos for dinner. The same meal that had started this whole nightmare months ago, when he took control of our family's eating habits. I set the table without saying anything and called the kids down. They came running and started building their tacos with actual enthusiasm, telling their dad about which toppings they were choosing and why. Mark sat at the head of the table in cold silence, picking at his food with his fork. But he did eat it. He cleaned his whole plate without complaining out loud. I considered that a small win, even though the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The next morning, I drove Mark to his first cardiac rehab appointment, and he complained the entire way there about how this was a waste of time when he could just walk around the block at home. I kept my hands on the steering wheel and didn't respond, because arguing wouldn't change anything. The facility was in a medical building attached to the hospital, with clean white walls and professional-looking equipment visible through the glass doors. We checked in at the front desk, and a nurse named Serenity Clay came out to greet us with a clipboard and a friendly, but no-nonsense, expression on her face. She took us back to the rehab area where treadmills and exercise bikes were set up with monitors and emergency equipment nearby. Mark reluctantly changed into workout clothes in a small locker room while I sat in the waiting area, watching other cardiac patients doing their exercises at various stations. Serenity attached monitor leads to Mark's chest and explained the program requirements in a firm voice that didn't leave room for negotiation. He got on the treadmill with obvious reluctance, and she started it at a very slow walking pace. Within 2 minutes, I could see sweat forming on his forehead, his breathing getting heavier. He looked genuinely surprised by how quickly he got winded from something as simple as slow walking. His face turned red, and he gripped the handrails tighter than necessary. 10 minutes into the session, Mark clutched his chest with one hand and told Serenity something felt wrong. She immediately hit the emergency stop button, and 2 other staff members rushed over to check his vitals. They took his blood pressure and pulse while asking him questions about the pain and where exactly he felt it. I stood up from my chair in the waiting area, my heart pounding, but forced myself to stay calm and not rush over. After several tense minutes, Serenity explained that it was minor muscle pain from the surgery rather than a new heart problem. The scare visibly shook Mark, and his bravado cracked just a little as he sat on the edge of the treadmill, looking pale and scared. Serenity sat down next to him and explained in a patient but firm tone that this was exactly why supervised rehab was necessary. She told him they could tell the difference between normal recovery pain and actual cardiac events, and that trying to exercise at home without monitoring could be dangerous, or even deadly. Mark nodded slowly and didn't argue back, for once. I watched his face change from defensive to genuinely frightened, and realized the scare might have actually reached him in a way my warnings never could. That evening, we sat down at the kitchen table with our bank statements and bills spread out in front of us, trying to figure out how we were going to manage on disability payments that were 60% of his normal salary. The numbers didn't add up, no matter how many times I recalculated them. We'd need to cut our cable service completely, reduce our phone plans to the cheapest option, stop eating out entirely, and delay some credit card payments just to cover the basics. The stress of it all made us both snappy and short-tempered with each other. I suggested he could sell his expensive gaming system and his whole collection of games to help with immediate bills. He got defensive immediately and said that was his only hobby, and the one thing he has for himself. I pointed out calmly that keeping the house and feeding our kids mattered more than video games right now. He sat there in angry silence for a long minute before finally agreeing it was necessary. We spent another hour going through every expense and cutting everything that wasn't essential. By the end of the night, we'd created a bare-bones budget that might just barely work, if nothing else went wrong. The next day, I took the kids grocery shopping and turned it into a teaching moment about reading nutrition labels and comparing products. We stood in the cereal aisle, and I showed them how to look at the sugar content per serving. Ellen picked up his favorite cereal and read the label, his finger following the numbers. His eyes went wide when he discovered it had more sugar than a candy bar. Tori grabbed a box of frozen meals she usually liked for lunch and was shocked by how much sodium was packed into each serving. I explained what sodium does to your body and why too much is bad for your heart, without lecturing or making them feel guilty about past choices. We spent extra time in the produce section, letting them pick vegetables they were willing to try eating. Ellen chose colorful bell peppers in red and yellow because he liked how bright they looked. Tori picked snap peas because she remembered eating them raw at a friend's house once and liking the crunch. I grabbed hummus for them to dip the vegetables in and explained that it was made from chickpeas and was full of protein and fiber. The kids seemed genuinely interested instead of resistant, and they helped me load the cart with fresh produce and lean proteins. I let them each pick one small treat as a reward for being good sports about the healthy shopping. Our first family therapy session with Sesh Newman happened 3 days later, and the awkwardness was thick from the moment we walked into his office. Mark sat in his chair with his arms crossed over his chest and barely participated in the conversation. Sesh asked open-ended questions about our family dynamics and how we communicated about health and food choices. I tried to answer honestly, while Mark just shrugged or gave one-word responses. Sesh gently pointed out the control dynamics in our relationship and noted that Mark used food as a power move, while I responded by completely withdrawing from the situation. Mark deflected immediately and said I was being controlling about what everyone ate and treating him like a child. Sesh acknowledged that both patterns were unhealthy but explained that the current crisis required new approaches from everyone. He asked Mark directly what food represented to him growing up and why he reacted so strongly to my suggestions about healthy eating. Mark shifted in his seat uncomfortably and didn't answer. Sesh didn't push but made a note on his pad and said we'd explore that more in future sessions. The hour felt like 3 hours, and we left without making much progress, but at least we showed up. Rhett scheduled a follow-up dietitian appointment the following week and had the kids create a visual meal plan with pictures of foods they liked that were also healthy. He gave them magazines and printed photos to cut out and paste onto a poster board. Ellen got excited about making his own smoothies with fruit and yogurt and cut out pictures of strawberries and bananas and blueberries. Tori wanted to learn to cook simple stir-fries with lots of vegetables and found photos of colorful peppers and broccoli and snap peas. Rhett encouraged their enthusiasm and wrote down recipes they could try at home. Mark sat through this session looking bored and non-committal. He checked his phone several times and only half listened to what Rhett was explaining about portion sizes and meal timing. I felt frustration building in my chest, but tried to stay focused on the kids' enthusiasm instead of Mark's resistance. The kids taped their meal plans to the refrigerator when we got home, and Ellen asked if we could make smoothies for breakfast tomorrow. Ellen went back to PE class with his new accommodations, which included modified activities and permission to take breaks without having to explain why. He came home that afternoon practically bouncing with excitement because he was able to participate in a relay race at his own pace and didn't get sick or teased. The PE teacher let him walk fast instead of run and positioned him as the anchor leg so he wouldn't hold up his team. His team actually won, and the other kids high-fived him and celebrated together. The teacher pulled him aside after class to praise his effort and tell him she was proud of how hard he tried. I could see Ellen's confidence starting to rebuild just a little bit as he told me the whole story with animated hand gestures. He asked if he could go to the park after homework to practice walking fast so he could maybe try jogging next week. That weekend, Tori and I went for a walk around the neighborhood together while Mark stayed home with Ellen. We made it 2 blocks before Tori complained that her knees hurt and asked if we could stop. I validated her feelings instead of pushing her to continue, and we sat on a bench at the corner park. I told her that bodies need time to adjust to new activities and that it's okay to go slow. She admitted she's embarrassed about not being able to keep up with her friends during recess when they run around playing tag. I share that I struggle with exercise, too, and that it's hard for me to stay motivated sometimes. We sat there together watching other kids play, and I made it feel less like a personal failure and more like something we were working on together as a team. Tori leaned against my shoulder and said she was glad I understood. We walked back home slowly and stopped twice more to rest. The next week, Mark tried to pressure me to stop at a drive-thru on the way home from his rehab appointment. He said he deserved a treat, for doing all the exercises and working so hard. I refused calmly but firmly and reminded him about what Dr. Watkins said about his arteries and his damaged heart. I offered to make him a satisfying meal at home instead, with the ingredients we bought at the grocery store. He sulked the rest of the drive home and wouldn't talk to me or even look in my direction. When we got home, he went straight to the bedroom and closed the door. I started helping the kids with their homework at the kitchen table. About 20 minutes later, I heard him on his phone in the bedroom, talking in a low voice. I didn't think much of it until a delivery driver knocked on our door an hour later with a bag from a burger place. The delivery arrived while I was still helping the kids with their math worksheets and spelling words. Mark took the bag and ate the greasy burger and fries in the living room while watching television. I didn't say anything, because arguing would just make things worse. Within an hour, he was in the bathroom with stomach distress, and I could hear him groaning and clearly in pain through the closed door. The kids heard everything too, because our house was small and the bathroom was right off the hallway. Tori started crying, saying she didn't want Daddy to die. Ellen looked toward the bathroom with something like disgust on his face instead of concern. I pulled Tori close and tried to comfort her while listening to Mark suffer the consequences of his choice. I realized this might be the wake-up call that actually reached all of them in a way my words never could. I finished helping the kids with their homework and got them ready for bed. Tori hugged me extra tight and asked if Daddy was going to be okay. I told her yes, even though I wasn't sure anymore. Ellen brushed his teeth without being asked and went straight to his room. I tucked them both in and waited until I heard their breathing get slow and steady. Mark was still in the bedroom with the door closed. I grabbed my keys and went outside to my car in the driveway. I sat in the driver's seat and locked the doors. Then I let myself cry. I was so angry at him for ordering that burger after everything we'd been through. I was scared he was going to die and leave me alone with two kids who just watched their father almost kill himself. I was mad that I had to be the grown-up while he acted like a child who couldn't control himself. The tears came hard, and I had to cover my mouth so the neighbors didn't hear. I thought about what happens if he dies. I thought about raising Ellen and Tori by myself. I thought about the medical bills and the mortgage and everything else. But sitting here falling apart wouldn't help anyone. I wiped my eyes with my sleeve and took some deep breaths. I had to stay calm. I had to stay steady. No matter what he does, I have to keep going for the kids. 3 days later, we had the follow-up appointment with Dr. Watkins at the hospital. Mark complained the whole drive there about having to take time off work. We sat in the exam room and waited. Dr. Watkins came in with a folder full of papers and test results. She reviewed his blood work and checked his heart with her stethoscope. Everything sounded okay for now. Then she pulled out some printed images and spread them on the table. She pointed to dark spots and blocked areas on pictures of his heart. She looked right at him and spoke in a clear, firm voice. If you keep eating like you did before, you will die within 5 years, maybe sooner. The bypass surgery bought you time, but it didn't fix the real problem. Your heart is damaged. These arteries can block up again if you don't change. She showed him another image with arrows pointing to the worst areas. Do you want to see your kids graduate high school? Do you want to walk your daughter down the aisle someday? Because the choices you make right now decide if that happens. Mark sat there looking pale and shocked. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Dr. Watkins put the images back in the folder and handed him a card for a support group. She told him to think hard about what matters most. We left the office in silence. That weekend, Mark's brother showed up at our house unannounced. He walked in carrying a 6-pack of beer and immediately started making jokes. He saw the vegetables I was chopping for dinner and laughed. Look at all this rabbit food. You guys eating like bunnies now? He pulled out his phone and showed Mark some pictures from the hospital. Remember when you were in that gown with your butt hanging out? Classic. He was laughing hard and slapping his knee. Mark looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. His brother kept going. Man, they got you on the heart-healthy diet now. That's rough. No more real food for you. I put down my knife and turned to face him, my voice colder than I intended. Those jokes aren't helpful right now. If you can't be supportive, then you should leave. His brother stopped laughing and looked surprised. Mark's eyes went wide. There was a long, awkward silence where nobody moved. Then his brother cleared his throat and mumbled an apology. He changed the subject and asked about work instead. The rest of the visit was tense, but at least he stopped making fun of us. On Monday morning, my phone rang while I was doing laundry. It was Dana from the school. She told me she wanted to check in about how the kids were doing. She said both Ellen and Tori were handling the peer comments much better now. Ellen found a group of friends who eat lunch with him and don't care what he brings. They talk about video games and sports instead of food. Tori had been working with the school counselor twice a week on positive self-talk. When someone said something mean, she had tools now to handle it. Dana said the bullying hadn't stopped completely, but it was better. The kids had strategies and they were using them. I thanked her and told her how much the school's help meant to our family. I hung up feeling grateful in a way I didn't expect. It helped to know we weren't dealing with this alone. On Wednesday, we had our second session with Sesh. We sat in his office with the soft chairs and the tissues on the table. Sesh asked Mark about his childhood and what food meant to him growing up. Mark was quiet for a long time. Then he started talking about being poor as a kid. He described being hungry a lot and having free lunch tickets at the school. The other kids would tease him about it. He talked about wearing clothes that were too small because his parents couldn't afford new ones. He said he promised himself that when he had his own family, they would never feel that way. They would never be hungry or feel poor or left out. Sesh listened carefully and then helped him see how he mixed up having plenty of food with showing love. How he thought controlling meals meant he was providing and being a good father. Mark's voice cracked when he talked about wanting to give his kids everything he didn't have. I felt my anger start to soften into something else. I was starting to understand, even though I wasn't excusing what he did. Then Sesh turned to me. He said gently that my approach to food before everything happened sometimes came across as judging instead of working together. I felt defensive at first, but then I thought about it. I admitted that I lectured everyone instead of including them in decisions. My tone probably made Mark feel attacked, like I was saying he was a bad father. Sesh talked about how we can change the way we think about healthy eating. Make it about caring for each other and having choices instead of rules and being told what to do. I agreed to try a different way. It was hard to admit I made mistakes too, but I knew he was right. That evening, we sat down as a family at the kitchen table. We had paper and markers, and everyone got to help make agreements about food. The kids were excited to have input. We wrote down things that were non-negotiable, like no fast food during the week and vegetables with every dinner. But we also added flexibility, like pizza on Friday nights and treats on weekends. Tori drew pictures of her favorite healthy foods. Ellen made a chart showing different meals we could rotate through the week. Mark sat there looking skeptical, but he agreed to try the plan for 1 month. If it works, we keep going, he said. If it doesn't, we talk about it and adjust. Everyone signed the paper, and we hung it on the fridge. A few days later, Tori came into the kitchen holding a cardboard box. She looked confused and hurt. She asked me if Daddy was lying about trying to be healthy. I looked in the box and saw candy bars and bags of chips. She told me she found it in the garage, tucked behind the tools. My first reaction was pure anger. I wanted to march into the living room and yell at him, but I took a breath and thought about what Sesh said. I decided we needed to handle this as a family. The kids deserved honesty about what was happening. I told Tori to keep the box, and we'd talk about it together at dinner. That evening, I called a family meeting. We all sat at the table, and Tori put the box in the middle. Mark's face turned red when he saw it. He looked embarrassed and angry at the same time. Ellen stared at his father and spoke in a quiet voice. He said he was scared. He didn't want his dad to die. He needed him to try harder. Mark started to say something defensive. His mouth opened, and I could see him getting ready to make excuses or get mad, but then he stopped himself. He closed his mouth and just sat there. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever. Then he apologized. His voice was shaky, and the words came out slow. He admitted he was struggling with cravings. He felt like a failure. He hid the food because he was ashamed. This was the first time since the hospital that he'd been completely honest with us. Tori started crying. I reached over and held her hand. Mark looked at both kids and promised to do better. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. A week later, Rhett called Mark and invited him to a group class at the hospital for cardiac patients. Mark didn't want to go, but I convinced him it might help. We drove there on Tuesday evening. The class was in a conference room with about 15 people sitting in a circle. They went around sharing their stories. A man who looked about Mark's age talked about his near-death experience. He described having a second heart attack 2 years after his first one. He missed his daughter's wedding because he was in the hospital. His voice broke when he talked about seeing the photos later and knowing he wasn't there. He told everyone that he thought he had more time. He thought he could cheat the system. But the heart doesn't care about excuses. I watched Mark's face while the man talked. He was actually listening. His usual defensive expression was gone. On the drive home, he was quiet and thoughtful. Then he asked me questions about the meal plan for the first time. Real questions about what he could eat and how to make it taste good. Not arguments or complaints, just questions. I answered them carefully, and we talked the whole way home. When we got home that night, I pulled out our bank statements and medical bills and spread them across the kitchen table. Mark sat down across from me, looking tired, and we started adding up numbers. His disability payments were 60% of his normal salary, and the medical bills kept arriving in the mail every few days. We owed the hospital $30,000 even after insurance, and the minimum monthly payment was $500 that we didn't have. I wrote down all our regular bills and subtracted them from his reduced income, and there was almost nothing left over. He stared at the numbers, and his face went pale. I suggested we needed to cut cable and reduce our phone plans and stop eating out completely. He nodded, but it still wasn't enough to cover everything. Then I brought up his gaming system and collections sitting in the basement. He bought the setup 3 years ago and spent thousands on games and controllers and a special chair. His jaw tightened, and I could see him wanting to argue, but instead he just sat there quiet. Finally he said we could sell it. His voice sounded defeated, and I knew this hurt him, because gaming was his way to relax after work, but he admitted out loud that keeping our family safe mattered more than his hobby. We spent the next hour taking photos of everything and writing descriptions and posting them online. Within 2 days, people started messaging with offers, and by the end of the week, we'd sold almost everything for enough to cover 2 months of minimum payments. The relief I felt was physical, like I could breathe deeper for the first time since the hospital. On Saturday morning, I saw a flyer for a community walk event at the local park, and I thought maybe this could help make exercise feel less like punishment. I told the kids we were going, and they seemed excited about the idea of walking with other families. Mark overheard and said he'd come too, but he was just going to watch. We drove to the park, and there were maybe 50 people gathered near the starting line with numbers pinned to their shirts. The kids and I signed up for the 1-mile loop, and Mark found a bench near the path. I watched him sit down heavily and pull out his phone. We started walking with the crowd, and Ellen kept pace beside me while Tori skipped ahead a little. About halfway through the loop, we passed Mark's bench, and I glanced over at him. He wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He was watching the families walking together with this expression on his face that made my chest hurt. It was longing mixed with embarrassment, and I could see him wanting to be out here with us, but feeling too ashamed of how out of shape he was. Other dads were walking with their kids and laughing, and he was sitting alone on a bench. When we finished the loop and came back to him, he asked how it was, and Ellen said it was fun. Mark nodded and looked away, and I realized he was fighting with himself about his limitations in a way he hadn't before. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was making dinner, and it was Serenity from cardiac rehab. She told me Mark had missed his last 2 appointments, and she was calling to follow up. Her voice was firm but not mean, and she explained that missing sessions would slow his recovery and increase his risk of another cardiac event. I felt anger rise in my chest because he told me he went to both appointments. Serenity said she needed to speak with him directly, so I handed him the phone. He took it, looking guilty, and walked into the other room. I could hear her talking through the wall, and she wasn't accepting his excuses about being busy or tired. She told him that inconsistent attendance meant he wasn't taking his recovery seriously, and that his heart didn't care about his excuses. Then she scheduled his next 3 sessions right there on the phone while he was still talking to her so he couldn't avoid committing. When he hung up, his face was red, but he wrote the appointments on the calendar without arguing. Over the next 2 weeks, he didn't miss a single session, and I realized something important. He responded better to external accountability from medical professionals than to me reminding him at home. When I nagged him, he saw it as control. But when Serenity or the doctors told him the same things, he actually listened. I decided to try a different approach with meals. One evening, I sat down with Mark and asked him to choose one satisfying meal per week that he wanted me to cook. I told him it needed to be something he really enjoyed, but we'd make it with healthier ingredients. He thought for a minute, then said, "Spaghetti and meatballs." I suggested we use lean ground turkey instead of beef and whole wheat pasta and add vegetables to the sauce. He looked skeptical, but agreed to try it. The next day, we went grocery shopping together for the first time in months. He pushed the cart while I picked out ingredients and explained why each choice was better. We got the ground turkey, and he held the package, reading the label. In the produce section, I let him pick which vegetables to add, and he chose mushrooms and bell peppers. Back home, we started cooking, and he stood at the counter, chopping the vegetables slowly. It was awkward because he'd never really cooked before, and he cut the peppers into uneven pieces, but he was trying, and I could see him taking ownership of the process instead of just complaining about what I served. When we sat down to eat, the kids said it tasted good, and Mark admitted it was pretty close to the regular version. He even went back for seconds, which surprised me. The school had a fall festival the following weekend with game booths and food stands set up in the parking lot. I packed a small cooler with apple slices and string cheese and crackers for the kids. We walked around looking at everything, and Ellen wanted to play the ring toss while Tori headed for the face painting booth. After an hour, they both asked if they could get something from the food stands. I told them they could each pick one treat and to choose carefully. Ellen walked up and down, looking at all the options before picking a small cotton candy. Tori got a caramel apple that was bigger than her hand. They sat on a bench, eating slowly and looking happy. I noticed they weren't scarfing the food down or hiding it or acting guilty. They were just enjoying their treats like normal kids. A mom I recognized from Tori's class came over and commented on how good the caramel apple looked. Another parent said something about the kids making healthy choices most of the time. I just smiled and nodded, without making it into a teaching moment or bragging about our progress. I wanted this to feel normal for them, not like some big accomplishment that put pressure on them. Late that night, after everyone was asleep, I sat at my computer and opened a private browser window. I typed in separation and divorce, and started reading articles about custody arrangements. I wasn't planning to leave right now, but I needed to know my options if Mark kept sabotaging his health. The articles talked about joint custody and child support and dividing assets. I read about how courts decide custody based on the best interest of the children. Then I looked up the financial side and saw that I'd need money for a lawyer and deposits on a new place. I opened our bank account and looked at the balance, and knew I couldn't afford to leave right now, even if I wanted to. So, I started making a plan. I printed out copies of our important documents like our marriage certificate, the kids' birth certificates, and our tax returns. I hid them in a folder in my car. Then I opened a separate savings account at a different bank and transferred $50 from our joint account. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I told myself this wasn't a decision yet. It was just preparation. Having a plan made me feel less trapped and more in control of my future. If Mark continued refusing to take care of himself, then I needed to be ready to protect myself and the kids. 3 days later, I was at my computer again when Mark came home early from work. He walked into the office, and I quickly closed the browser, but I wasn't fast enough. He saw the divorce lawyer website on the screen before it disappeared. His face went white, then red, and he asked what I was looking at. I took a breath and decided to be honest. I told him I'd been researching separation options. He started to get defensive and then stopped himself. Instead, he asked quietly if I was leaving him. His voice was shaking, and all the usual bravado was gone. I told him honestly that I didn't know. "I can't watch you slowly kill yourself and traumatize our kids in the process," I said, my voice breaking. "If you're not going to take your recovery seriously, then I need to think about protecting Ellen and Tori and myself." He sat down hard in the desk chair and put his face in his hands. Then he started crying. Actual tears, not just watery eyes. He said he was terrified of losing his family. He admitted he'd been scared every single day since waking up in the hospital. He was scared of dying and scared of changing and scared of failing at recovery. This was the first time since the heart attack that he'd been completely honest and vulnerable with me. I sat there watching him cry and felt my anger mixing with sadness. Part of me wanted to comfort him, and part of me thought he should have been honest weeks ago instead of hiding snacks and lying about rehab. We stayed up until 2 in the morning having the hardest conversation of our marriage. I told him I needed him to agree to a clear separation of control where I made the health decisions for our family. His role needed to be specific and measurable, not just promises to try harder. He needed to attend every single rehab appointment without excuses. He needed to follow the meal plan we created together and not hide food or order delivery behind my back. He needed to keep going to therapy with Sesh and actually participate instead of sitting there with his arms crossed. I told him if he couldn't do those things, then I needed to protect the kids and myself by leaving. He was crying and nodding and saying he understood. I got a piece of paper and wrote down each specific commitment. Attend all cardiac rehab sessions 3 times per week. Take medications daily at scheduled times. Follow meal plan with no hidden food or secret orders. Attend therapy weekly and participate honestly. Walk together as a family 4 evenings per week. I wrote my own commitments, too. Lead meal planning and preparation with his input. Support his recovery without nagging or criticism. Communicate concerns directly instead of withdrawing. We both signed the paper, and I put it on the refrigerator where we'd see it every day. It felt real and binding like a contract. And I thought, maybe this is what we needed all along. Over the next 2 weeks, we worked on building a routine that actually felt doable. Mark set alarms on his phone for his medications and took them at the same time every morning and evening. He went to cardiac rehab on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday without missing once. After dinner, we put on our shoes and walked around the neighborhood together as a family. Some nights he only made it 2 blocks before getting tired, but he did it. There were slip-ups, where he ate too much at dinner or said he was too tired for the walk, but instead of fighting about it, I just wrote it in a notebook we kept on the counter. The next day, we looked at what happened and figured out how to adjust. Maybe he needed a bigger lunch so he wasn't as hungry at dinner. Maybe we needed to walk earlier before he got too tired. The kids watched us working together instead of screaming at each other, and I could see them relaxing. Tori stopped looking scared every time. We sat down to eat. Ellen started talking more at dinner instead of staying quiet and tense. At the follow-up lab appointment the next week, we sat in Dr. Watkins' office, waiting for results. She came in with papers in her hand and actually smiled, which was something I hadn't seen from her before. She told Mark his cholesterol numbers had dropped significantly from where they were right after surgery. His bad cholesterol was down almost 40 points, and his good cholesterol was up. His blood pressure was in a healthier range, too. She said if he maintained this trajectory, he'd significantly reduced his risk of another cardiac event. Mark sat up straighter and asked how much he'd reduced the risk. She explained it was hard to give exact numbers, but following his current plan could add years to his life. He looked genuinely proud of himself for the first time since this whole thing started. She scheduled his next appointment for 3 months out instead of 1 month, and said that was a good sign. On the drive home he was quiet, but I could tell he was processing what she said. I realized the doctor's encouragement meant more to him than anything I could say. He needed to hear from medical professionals that his efforts were working, not just from his wife, who he saw as nagging him. The next week, I scheduled checkups for both kids with their pediatrician to see how the changes were affecting them. Ellen went first and stepped on the scale, looking nervous, but the doctor pulled up his chart and smiled. She told him his weight hadn't dropped much yet, but that was actually good because kids shouldn't lose weight too fast. What mattered more was that his energy was better, and he was eating vegetables and whole grains now instead of fast food every day. She measured his blood pressure, and it had come down from the borderline high reading 3 months ago. Ellen asked if he was doing okay, and she told him he was doing great, that slow and steady wins the race. Tori's appointment was similar, with the doctor praising her for making healthier choices and noting that her stamina had improved based on what the PE teacher reported. Both kids left the office looking relieved instead of ashamed, and I realized how much pressure they'd been carrying about their bodies. The pediatrician pulled me aside and said to keep focusing on health and energy rather than weight loss, especially with kids, because that's what builds sustainable habits. I thanked her and felt validated that our approach was working, even if the changes weren't dramatic or fast. That evening, Mark asked to talk to me privately after the kids went to bed. We sat in the living room, and he looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his hands. He told me he'd been thinking about what he said at the steakhouse, and he needed to apologize. He said calling me controlling was wrong, and telling Ellen not to be weak like me was cruel and unfair. He admitted that I was trying to protect our family, and he turned it into a power struggle because of his own issues about feeling like he wasn't in charge. The apology was awkward, and he stumbled over his words, but I could tell he meant it. I told him I forgave him, but that rebuilding trust takes time and consistent action, not just words. He nodded and said he understood, and we sat there in silence for a minute before he reached over and squeezed my hand. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it felt real, and that mattered more than perfect. A few days later, some of his co-workers stopped by the house to visit and check on him. I answered the door, expecting them to have bags of chips and candy like last time, but instead they were holding a fruit basket and flowers. Mark came to the door and actually told them before they came in that we weren't keeping junk food in the house anymore because he was serious about his recovery. They looked surprised but respected it, coming inside and asking genuine questions about cardiac rehab and how he was feeling. One of them mentioned that his own dad had a heart attack last year and asked what the rehab exercises were like. Mark talked honestly about how hard it was and how scared he was. No jokes or deflection, just real conversation. I watched from the kitchen while making coffee and saw him sitting forward, engaged in the discussion, and he looked almost proud talking about the work he was doing. His co-workers stayed for an hour, and when they left, they told him they were glad he was taking care of himself and to let them know if he needed anything. After they went, he looked at me and said, "That felt better than making jokes and pretending everything was fine." Thanksgiving arrived, and we hosted dinner with extended family, including Mark's brother, who had made all those weight jokes before. We set up the table with turkey and sides, and everyone filled their plates. Mark took reasonable portions and loaded up on vegetables, and I saw his brother watching. His brother opened his mouth and made a comment about portion sizes looking small, clearly setting up for another joke. Before I could say anything, Mark cut him off firmly. He told his brother that jokes about his health weren't funny anymore, and he'd appreciate support instead of teasing. The room went quiet, and his brother looked shocked, mumbling an apology. Ellen reached over and squeezed his dad's hand under the table, and Tori smiled at him. I felt something shift in our family dynamic, like we were finally on the same team instead of divided. The rest of dinner was pleasant, and his brother actually asked respectful questions about the recovery process. The next Saturday afternoon was beautiful, so we packed up and headed to the park. The kids ran ahead to the playground while Mark and I found a bench. Ellen went straight to the track and started running, and I held my breath watching him. He made it around the entire lap without stopping and came back grinning and proud. Not even that winded. Tori climbed all over the playground equipment without checking if her clothes were going to rip or if other kids were staring, just enjoying herself like a normal kid. Mark and I sat on the bench watching them play, and he reached for my hand. We sat there together, holding hands, and feeling something like hope for the first time in months. It wasn't that everything was perfect or fixed, but we could see actual progress, and that made me believe we might actually make it through this. Our third therapy session with Sesh came around, and we talked about the control versus care dynamic again. Sesh suggested we set a shared cooking goal where Mark prepared one meal per week with my support. He explained that collaboration builds trust and gives Mark agency while keeping the family on track with health. Mark actually engaged in the conversation instead of sitting there defensive and closed off. He asked questions about how to plan a meal and what ingredients to use. Sesh gave us homework assignments to plan the first meal together and shop for it as a team. We left the session, and Mark seemed energized instead of drained, talking in the car about what he might want to cook. I suggested starting with something simple, and he agreed, deciding on chicken and vegetable stir-fry. We shopped for ingredients that week, and he read recipes online to prepare. Saturday evening came, and he took over the kitchen while I supervised from the counter. He chopped vegetables carefully and cooked the chicken in the wok, adding sauce and seasoning. The meal ended up oversalted and slightly burned in spots, but the kids ate it anyway and praised him for trying. I added soy sauce to mine without commenting on the mistakes. He looked embarrassed, but also proud that he completed something. And after dinner, we sat down and talked about what he'd do differently next time. He said he'd use less salt and cook on lower heat, treating it like a learning experience rather than a failure. I told him I'm proud of him for trying, and he actually smiled. 3 months after the surgery, we went back for the surgical follow-up with Dr. Watkins. She reviewed his test results and latest scans, then looked up at us with obvious satisfaction. She told Mark she was clearing him to return to light-duty work because his recovery was going well. She reiterated that he wasn't cured and would need to maintain these changes permanently and that backsliding could be fatal, but she was encouraged by his commitment and the progress he'd made. Mark asked intelligent questions about long-term management and what warning signs to watch for. I could see he was actually engaged with his own health in a way he wasn't before the crisis. Dr. Watkins scheduled his next appointment for 6 months out instead of 3 months, which she said was a good sign. Mark's first day back at work arrived, and I was nervous for both of us. I packed him a healthy lunch with grilled chicken salad, fruit, and nuts to avoid the temptation of vending machines. He kissed me goodbye and headed out, looking both excited and scared. Around noon, his coworkers took him out to celebrate his return at a restaurant near their office. He texted me a photo of his meal, a big salad with grilled salmon, while his coworkers had burgers and fries around him. The text said they were giving him a hard time, but he was holding the line. I responded with encouragement and a heart emoji, feeling like we were finally on the same team instead of fighting each other. He came home that evening tired but happy, saying, "It felt good to be back at work and useful again." Late one night, about a week later, I woke up and realized Mark wasn't in bed. I checked my phone and saw it was past midnight. My phone rang, and it was him, his voice shaky. He told me he was sitting in the McDonald's parking lot near our house, looking at the lit-up menu. He said the craving hit him hard, and he drove here before he really thought about it. I took a breath and talked him through it without judgment, reminding him about how far he'd come and asking if the temporary satisfaction was worth risking everything. He sat quiet on the phone for a minute, then said he was turning the car around. 20 minutes later, he walked through the front door, and we went to the kitchen together. I made popcorn, and we settled on the couch to watch a movie. He told me that calling instead of giving in felt like a real victory, that he almost ordered but stopped himself and reached out instead. I told him I'm proud of him, and that's what progress looks like. Not perfection, but better choices when it counts. The next week, we started something that became our new Thursday tradition. I set out bowls of diced tomatoes, shredded lettuce, black beans, grilled chicken strips, cheese, and salsa on the counter, and the kids came running when they smelled the taco shells warming in the oven. Mark stood at the cutting board, chopping peppers and onions, moving slowly but deliberately. And when Tori asked if she could help, he handed her the grater for the cheese. Ellen set the table without being asked and filled everyone's water glasses. And we all gathered around the counter to build our tacos together. Mark added extra vegetables to his and skipped the cheese, making choices without me having to say anything. And the kids piled their plates high with colorful ingredients they actually wanted to eat. We sat down together, and Tori announced that Thursday taco night was her favorite dinner now, better than McDonald's ever was. And Ellen agreed between big bites of his creation. Mark reached over and squeezed my hand across the table. A silent acknowledgement that we were doing this together now, and mealtimes felt cooperative instead of like a battle I was fighting alone. The tacos became our symbol of the new normal we were building, where healthy eating is something we choose as a family rather than something I force on everyone while they resent me for it. One evening a few weeks later, I sat on the back porch after the kids went to bed and let myself think about how far we'd actually come since the steakhouse. Mark still struggled with cravings and got defensive sometimes when I suggested we skip dessert. And I still felt angry when I remembered him calling me controlling and telling Ellen not to be weak like me. The kids had hard days too. When Tori came home upset about comments on her lunch choices, or Ellen felt frustrated that he was still slower than his friends in PE. We weren't some perfect family now where everything was fixed and everyone was happy all the time. But the explosive fights were fewer, the communication was better than it was, and we were all genuinely trying instead of working against each other. That felt like enough for now, like progress that might actually stick instead of some dramatic transformation that falls apart the first time things get difficult. The next weekend, we set up systems to help us maintain what we'd built instead of sliding backward. I bought a big pill organizer and filled it with Mark's medications for the whole week, labeling each day clearly so he couldn't forget or skip doses. We printed out his cardiac rehab schedule and posted it on the fridge with magnets right next to the meal plan chart the kids helped design. Then we sat down as a family and went over the warning signs of cardiac distress, making sure Ellen and Tori knew what to watch for and what to do if their dad had chest pain or trouble breathing. We practiced the steps together, with the kids taking turns calling 911 on a disconnected phone and describing the emergency clearly. It was scary to talk about, and Tori got teary imagining something happening to her dad again, but we pushed through the discomfort because being prepared felt better than being helpless. Mark added the emergency numbers to everyone's phones and showed the kids where he kept his medication list and insurance cards. The safety net we built together gave me confidence that these changes can last long-term, that we have structures in place to catch us if anyone starts to slip. For months after my husband collapsed face first into that massive steak, our family sat down to dinner together on a regular Tuesday night. I looked around the table and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. A mix of genuine relief and cautious optimism about our future. Mark is consistently attending cardiac rehab 3 times a week and seeing his therapist every other week, taking real ownership of his recovery instead of fighting against it. His latest test results show his cholesterol dropping and his blood pressure in a healthy range. And Dr. Watkins said his heart function is improving steadily. He's actually engaged in family meal planning now, suggesting recipes and helping cook instead of undermining everything I try to do. The kids are healthier and more confident, eating balanced meals without shame or rebellion. And they've completely stopped asking for McDonald's or begging for fast food. Ellen made it through a whole PE class yesterday without getting winded, and Tori wore her favorite jeans that fit comfortably again. We're eating at home together almost every night, with my boundaries finally respected and my role as the person who keeps us healthy acknowledged instead of mocked. The road ahead still requires constant effort and vigilance, and I know we'll have setbacks and hard days ahead. But we've built sustainable routines and honest communication, and all 4 of us are in genuinely better places than we were before the crisis. Life isn't perfect, and probably never will be, but we're facing the challenges together as a team instead of as enemies. The truth is, sometimes the biggest wake-up calls come wrapped in the most painful packages, and it takes a life-threatening crisis to truly find your way back to each other. It's been a long and winding journey for us, full of incredibly difficult moments, but also small, hard-won victories. I'm curious, what would you have done in my place when your partner dug in their heels like that? And have you ever had to navigate such a massive health crisis that completely changed your family's dynamic? Let me know in the comments below. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts.